This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is Sunday, January the 27th, 2019, the last Sunday already of January. And this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways. Again, still white again after 2 straight days of snowfall and everything else that's been on Dave's plate for the last week.
Well, I have some thoughts about spring. It's not here yet. We're in the middle of winter. But spring starts with species that are going to come up even when there's snow. And if we need support for different programs that involve natural history, then we need your involvement. There are good prairies around town that are reconstruction prairies, but the ones we're most concerned about are remnant prairies, and especially the remnant prairies in old cemeteries and on railroad beds, because that's the only place where they were protected. We want you to be prepared for spring. And knowing some of these species is not quite so easy. So we're talking at a level where you sometimes need to know the botanical name. You need to know how to follow birds, how to follow butterflies, and how to look at soils and geology. So I want to take you to some of the 3 counties that are around Champaign County. Champaign County was flat, very fertile, with glacial till, covered by loess, a wind-blown material, and you need to know some of those sorts of things. So on the academic end of this is people who are skilled in these various fields, and we take advantage of them. But we also need to introduce you to some native material and native circumstances that are near to Champaign County. There's 3 surrounding counties, Vermilion County, with some fault patterns geologically, and some terrain that Native Americans could live in poor weather, but then move into Champaign County with its rich soils and cultivate their corn and melons and whatever they could do, and to hunt. There was Piatt County, which has a lodge park, which is really a gem as far as natural history is concerned. And then up the road from Lodge Park, there is Shady Rest, which is also a dedicated natural area. A little down the road is Allerton Park, which people cherish for its house and gardens and sculpted pieces, but it also has very nice natural history. If you go to DeWitt County, that's a little further away, but it's the center for Clinton Lake and Weldon Springs State Park, a very popular state park. And that gives you a chance to look at some of the genuine remnant native material. We've been talking about other natural areas, and we did in the last program look at the agenda for the coming Tuesday's meeting of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission at Springfield. And depending on the weather and the circumstance, I will be hoping to be there. And one of the things I'll be concerned about is the width of the Kickapoo Trail. The two ends have been in action. 7 miles between Urbana and St. Joe is very popular, but unfortunately it has taken out most of the prairie that was the basis of early ecologists here. There was Gleason, first of all, at the turn of the century, who studied Illinois natural history, and even at that time, most of Illinois was expended for agriculture. So he was looking especially at areas in Mason County to the west, where there were sand dunes, the material where you had a rush of water from melting glaciers coming down the Illinois River and dumping a fair bit of sand and silt that later, as the climate warmed up and the material dried up and the waterways somewhat dried up, then that material was blown across the state. So there are very interesting examples of 14 ecosystems. They range from southern bald cypress Gulf Coast ecology to the north, where you have a little bit of area of non-glaciated material and moraines and outwash plains, and so each of the presenters, staff members of the Nature Preserves Commission, will be presenting cases for pieces of prairie that range in size. It might be 80 acres, but it might also be a quarter of an acre of the English prairie at Kempton. These people do an excellent job of the sort of things we're talking about. And they suggest, and we reference to Jefferson Post, a book that deals with Illinois ecosystems in such a way that it encourages you to explore yourselves. It might be that you're located next to a natural area like a prairie chicken series of natural areas, or it might be a stony area that was uplifted with the Ozark uplift and gives you a different sort of atmosphere. Just an aside, this week had a call from the water company, and the reason was that I had noticed that we had usage of water which was high, and I was looking for possible leaks, and we did have some with a boiler problem. But in talking to the person that was answering the phone, I found out that she was from south of East St. Louis in Jersey County, near to Monroe County, and we had a discussion about the natural areas that she was interested in her area. In here, we also have to be working with the Rail to Trail organization and also with the Federal Surface Transportation Board, because we need to preserve some of the prairie that's on either side of the ballast, that it becomes a rail trail. It was noticed by federal Congress that bicycle people were buying these railroad beds. Not only bicycle people, but also hiking people and also natural history people. May Watts, who was the daughter of Coles, who was one of the early natural history ecologists in the sand dune areas of Lake Michigan, wrote a book that looked at natural history and cultural details between Chicago and Florida. She would come to the University of Illinois as a person to adjudicate on student projects and things like that, and to also talk to us. Behind this is some history. The people who came along after Gleason were Vestal and Shelford and Kendi, and these people rented from the Big Four Railroad areas between Urbana and Mayview that were very good prairie. They were there to demonstrate prairie, and they were there to preserve prairie and utilize it for student theses. That went on till the early 60s, and those three gentlemen were working with a student named George Fell, who eventually, with the cooperation of these people who formed a ecological union. So George and his wife went off to Washington. They had already been working in the Rockford area, where an airport was thinking to take out a prairie in order to extend a runway. And George and his wife had been vital in saving that site. So George and his wife bought a house and a offset press and started a nature conservancy. So the rail trail that we have between Urbana and St. Joe is tremendously successful. It's a realization that it helps to bring communities together. It has business advantages. There's a restaurant at St. Joe which is doing very well at the end of the 7 miles. There is federal money coming from the Rail Banking Act, which uses bicycle people to, and hikers and biologists to create a trail that then inspires state money to help put in Park District endpoints at Banner and Danville. It's inspired agency money and also private individual money. So there's a fair bit of money invested in this process. The one thing that is a problem for us is that it is so wide that it takes out the natural area. There's also another problem, and that the widening of an adjacent road takes precedence. So eminent domain says it takes it basically out of the right-of-way of the railroad, which narrows the opportunity for prairie preservation. Not all is lost, but one of the cruel things that happens is that it's cheaper to take a bulldozer and run it along this corridor and sculpt everything. And that means that the remnant prairie is disturbed and destroyed in most cases. It's rather unfortunate. The more expensive way of doing this is to look at your plan, and if you only have to move 3 inches of soil, you do it with a hi-ho that sits on the side of the ditch that you are expanding or molding, and deals with that particular spot. It is cheaper to put a bulldozer in with a laser beam and tear up the ground and then sculpt it back, and then the temptation is to give that land back to the nature people to replant it. And that's okay. That's a positive, but it also means that prairie that was used by Vestal and Shelford and Kennedy and others is gone. If only 3 inches has to be removed, that often is dealing with perennial plants that have deep roots, and they will come back. If you go down 3 feet on a compass plant and take out a 45-pound root, then the root that remains 2 feet down will regenerate. And so there are adventitious buds that allow this to happen. In some cases, you will have to lose material because it's essential for a drainage pattern, and we realize that is important. But I'm hoping that the next elements of the railroad bed between St. Joe, Ogden, and Fithian, and Oakwood will be modestly wide. It's very nice to have a wide trail, but we also do have roads. And as people get used to bicycles, then bicycles also use the roads. And there's an ambience here. You have roads that are in the cornfields and the soybeans, and you would hope that we would retain some of the natural history that would give you a different experience when you are on a trail. There's also a problem that when you're given back that sculpted landscape, you're going to have to restore it. And this restoration goes to a parallel roadside where there's a roadside ditch, and usually that roadside ditch is mown. It's felt that it's a danger to be too close to a road, but there's a temptation to plant plants that grow quickly And there's also a temptation to put in pollinators like sweet clover that are invasive and compete with any prairie that's going to come back. So not only do you have the sculpting in the first place, but you have the replanting. And when you're doing this sort of thing, the remnants that are there have been invaded. They're not the world's greatest. They happen to be the only one that we have locally. So there's a real temptation to go in to what remnants are left and look daggy, to plant them to plants to make them look more up to date. If we're trying to find out what previous prairies looked like, then we're very dependent on restorations or a little of the original so that we can study it. So there's that temptation to go in as restorers and plant material into what is left. So that is another biological problem. We do have people who volunteer to pick seed and create a prairie. And you would be amazed that give it 10 or 15 or 20 years and you can create first perhaps 12 species of prairie, broadleaves plus grasses, just a sprinkling of grasses, not too much so that they don't dominate. You can get to 24 species and then the 36 species. And then you get to the point where you don't know about the bacteria and the fungi and the microorganisms. And you look at plants that are fairly rare, that are likely to be subject to deer and rabbits, and you almost have to have glass house or greenhouse in the background so that you can develop these plants for perhaps 3 years so that they're large enough and rooted enough that they will survive the animals that seem to be overpopulated. So once we have the trail, we have the people who pick seed, and we have to educate them to do it at the right time of the year. If you're waiting for students to come back and it's spring, it's fall, and you pick seed in the fall, then it's very possible that you have seed which is a fall spectrum of seed. So then you have to have people who are looking at the prairie in spring to get some of the liliaceous type plants, the ones that come early in the season, that come out almost when the snow is still there. And that might be in the wrong time of the year to get student help to do this. So you have to also have people in the background who know where to find something that is only known to a few people and in a few places, and you have to be very genuine about that. So we can come back with a prairie, give it a few years. One of the problems is that we suspect that the engineering of a trail is one size fits all. And that one size fits all may apply to 23,000 miles of popular rail trails that help to save railroad right-of-way. I've been trying to call Surface Transportation Board, but it's been on furlough. But we need to know what are the rules for ASTO, which is Association of Highway Engineers and Officials. And that organization supervises specifications for rail trails, and they have a lot to do with working with the very popular rail trail movement, which has supporters on both sides of the aisle, political aisle. You have to be able to talk to federal regulators, state regulators, and local regulators. And often we're dealing with the conflict between preservation and recreation. And recreation is much more popular and well known and understood than preservation. So knowing all that, and looking at 10 or more miles of prairie that is prairie soil that has been relatively undisturbed because railroads are put in a linear manner. You have a train that is loaded with rail, and you put the rail in front of you, and then you move on to the new track. So the edges beside the ballast are fairly undisturbed, relatively undisturbed. I want to have at least some of you out there interested in the spring side of these plantings, because sometimes they are avoided because they're hard to do. If you have a starry-eyed grass, it flowers early in the season, and you almost have to put a flag on it in order to find it, because it's about 6 inches high. It has these little rounded seeds. You have to get down on your belly and to find where they are. They're green, that then very shortly they'll drop. So you have to be patient. And when you plant that seed, it has to have been vernalized. That means it has to be in the snow for a time with moisture, so that it gets the idea that it needs to grow. And that is another whole spectrum of concern, is if we buy seed, where do we buy it from? Did this seed grow in Washington State, or did it grow in the Midwest, or did it grow in a rough and tough packaged natural seed presentation from Texas or somewhere else? And there has to be a time for the appropriate seeding and the care. There has to be a balance. If you have too many grasses in there, they're going to grow well, they're going to grow quickly, and they're going to deny the broadleaves. So we're very, very dependent on biologists to know when to buy, where to buy, what is certified, and what do you know is responsible. We tend to buy from Prairie Moon, which has been at this game for many years. It has a lot of Illinois gene pool. So, okay, think about that railroad bed, and think about how you would approach engineers. It can be extremely friendly, because they too realize that our grandchildren will not have anything like what their grandparents had for resources. The young population is beginning to realize that if they don't speak up, they won't be able to enjoy the ecology that we talk about. knowing that, let's go back to spring and have you visit some natural areas. It's quite helpful to go to natural areas that have been recreated, like Meadowbrook Park. Early on, it was planted fairly heavily to grasses. Then it was realized, and Audubon and other groups got together and picked seeds. So it's getting to be more biodiverse by the year. So we encourage you to go. That's in Champaign. That's near to Champaign-Urbana. That's available. Go look at some of the rough and tough species that can survive on a reconstructed cornfield. Then I want to take you to those other 3 counties that are surrounding the Champaign County, which was basically prairie. Early settlement in Champaign County was not in the prairie because it was very damp and wet and full of malaria, spread by mosquitoes. And also they'd often come from areas in Europe that were forested, and it's always more friendly to be able to save a tree than it is to save a prairie, which frankly looks like weeds to people who don't know better. So let's go out of town a little bit, 25 miles to Monticello. And let's imagine that we're an early settler, and he's coming up from New Orleans, probably with family. He comes up with probably a paddle wheeler to the junction of the Illinois and Mississippi River. He comes up the Illinois River to Sangamon. And he's come up the Sangamon River, usually in springtime when the river is flowing with a little bit of spring rain, but also melting snow. He can come up through to Decatur, to Monticello, and to a place called Lodge Park. Lodge Park is near to the Railroad Museum. In this day when the settler was coming, there would not have been any railroad. But if you're going to see Lodge Park, you're going to have the Railroad Museum as a indicator of that you're in the right place. And you get off at a cloverleaf there and go west. That means when you get onto the road which is called Shady Rest Road, you turn right and you're near to Lodge Park. Lodge Park was cherished by a gentleman named Lodge, who felt that this was an ideal place for a preservation. If it's winter time and you're out there looking, it's rather wonderful because you can tell a lot in wintertime. The buds of the trees will let you know what trees are there. The litter that is on the top of a prairie will let you know what is underneath. So a winter excursion is helpful. The park may be closed through traffic. Lodge Park has a circuitous road that runs from an entrance area which has large savanna-like oak trees and picnic areas. Then there's some open space, and then there's an artificial lake that blocks a little creek. But if you're walking or if you're driving, depending on what time of the year it is, you can go down across that little creek, and it is wet enough that it creates a wetland situation that you can enjoy. Climb up the other side, and there's about a half mile of rather wonderful understory herbs, spring herbs, on either side of the road, and you're running along the bank of the Sangamon River. You can catch glimpses of the Sangamon bottomland. You can see the river is meandering. It runs in sigmoid curves, and so it may be carving in on one side and dumping on the other side, and over thousands of years we will be moving down the river some. But this is a little higher, and there you are. Even if you're in a car, you don't even need to get out to be able to see the spring herbs that are there. So an early settler would have come to that sort of atmosphere, with bottomland forests, with maples, and a lot of maples, but upland of oak hickory forest. And this is a park that has also been planted to conifers that don't belong in a manner of natural history, but are also interesting. So they're tall, and they create a cathedral where people get married and enjoy that sort of atmosphere. But back to the half mile that is full of early spring herbs, and you have to be out there early to know what they are, how they could be utilized in a prairie forest ecosystem. And we're talking about restoration of prairie and forest. Some of the prairie plants that we have, a prairie forest ecosystem, need shade. So if you're looking at something like wild ginger or bloodroot, you're looking at plants that need shade. Wait a few weeks and go out there again. You can go out there 1,000 times. It'll be different. There will be a slug of understory herbs. First of all will come spring beauty and violets and jack in the pulpit and mayapple, and enough to send you crazy. Wild geranium, they all come in a different sequence. So if you go on one day, you won't find the whole lot. If you go a little further to the end of this wonderful half mile, you'll find a little road that goes down and across the river to Buck's Pond on the other side of the river. That access has been closed because it has been malused. People would take vehicles into the river when they shouldn't have been there, and so they have that access has been closed. But on that side of the river, if you can access it by a different road, there's Indian sort of Trail of the Tears storylines that indicate that the native population was here first. And they were migrants too. But you can see that site, and you can see that over the years the area has changed some, because the river meanders will cut in and cut into the embankment that is on the north side and make a beach on the south side. You continue this little road around, and there is more natural history, but you have to know that these places have been cut over. The bigger trees have been used. The early settlers that came, so if you're looking at our family that came up the river and couldn't probably go too much further than Monticello, there's a little community that settled called Musgrove. And there is today a couple of grindstones that belonged to a mill that was there. So the early settlers needed to grind their corn flour. They needed to be able to use power to make lumber available for buildings. So the elements of a long race are there, where if you're in a flat country, you have to make a race that will take water to a mill wheel where the water will turn the mill. So it has to be high enough by the time it gets there to turn that mill. So a long race, possibly a little dam that will allow you to collect the water and turn the mill. There's also a little outlet that you have to have. And often there was a little bit of making of levees to make some of these things work. Now, just up the road on Shady Rest Road, it used to be called Monticello Road, there is Shady Rest. And Shady Rest is also on the Sangamon. And it's 30 acres. It was platted for development that never happened, but it is available to the public and it belongs to the Fayette County Forest Preserve, and they put trails in it. It's partially bottomland forest, but it's also got some elements of the Cerro Gordo Moraine. So it has upland forest and bottomland forest, an adjacency to the Sangamon River. If you're a forester and you go to Shady Rest, you'll notice that there are big trees and little trees, lots and lots of maples. And many of them will die, but it's an understory beside the native understory herbs. And that will tell the forester that this was a picnic ground for an era where you could bring a horse perhaps from Champaign or Decatur or other communities without stressing the horse. So we have a natural area. Then you can go to the research and find out whether this site was used for a Chautauqua. A Chautauqua is where people with political interests, with spiritual interests, with just fun interests would hold a meeting, perhaps for a week. The natural area has been designated as a soil and water conservation preservation. So you can't do a lot to do cultural things, but it's possible that we could do that in the future. So where does our settler settle? He settles basically in this sort of forested area, whether it be Shady Rest or Lodge Park. Probably Lodge Park is a little more natural than Shady Rest, although the Shady Rest is very good. Now, present day, you have more development. You have a town, a county seat with a square that's fairly natural. You had entrepreneurs coming in. The early entrepreneurs discovered Pepsin, developed a Pepsin factory. It started out as a apple cider press in a storefront on the county seat in the square, and then it moved into a Piatt family, Piatt County settlers, had a big house not too far away, and this Pepsin has a capacity to settle stomach disturbances and to help constipation and things like that, and it replaced some rather stringent things. And it was very popular. The railroad lines grew around it, and it became internationally famous. And it gradually evolved into Monticello having a state street that was a center for people who were, it was referred to as the Millionaire Mile. The entrepreneurs were doing something that has a character in economics. It's where somebody discovers something, maybe like Dr. Colwell didn't really want to move the idea where he would be a president of the group. They got together a group of people who, one of the leaders was a person named Hott, and they developed this facility. So now you're in a different era. That settler, whether it be belonged to the White family and the Heath family, which is a little town to the excuse me, to the north of Monticello. These families that are still around and settled early. They didn't settle in the swampland. The federal government would sell uplands, but often places that are low were not sold easily. But gradually, you had railroads coming in. You replaced that canoe or whatever came up the stream to settle, more or less using it like a canal. You replace it with railroads. And Mr. Jefferson had decided that there should be a north, south, east, west Platte, so you could find your plot when you bought it in Europe and didn't know where it was. That facilitated, but the Platte didn't exactly work out around rivers and swamps and things, so there's some modification. But then the mainline railroad came from Chicago, the Illinois Central, and gradually got to Champaign and then eventually got to New Orleans. But then there were the lines that wanted to go east-west and cross the Illinois River and cross the Mississippi River and meet up with railroads coming from the west. It wasn't easy, and there were quite a few of these organizations. So the railroads were 5 miles apart, so a horse drawing grain would not be put upon So there are small elevators every 5 miles. Whether that be north-south or east-west. So if you're in a plane, you couldn't do it at this time, but if you had an imagination and sat 1,000 feet above the local scenery, you can see these railroads everywhere. Small elevators that would, well, there were boxcars in the first place. You would shovel your grain into the boxcar. Later you had wagons that you could put into the wagon, and you didn't have to put boards up and in a boxcar. There was a main line coming from Chicago. It is currently the Norfolk Southern, and it used to go south and meet up with a major east-west line called the Wabash. It comes through at Bement. So this settler that we're talking about, probably in the White Heath area, would be starting to use railroads in an era when there weren't automobiles. Gradually, if you had oxen or donkeys or other modes, horses, you would have a road of convenience which usually paralleled the railroad line. But many of the more recent settlers came to Piatt County, Champaign County, the counties around, by rail. Now you have a railroad museum, and it teaches people who have gone through the railroad era to a road and expressway era, and many young people have never ridden on a train. So the Railroad Museum is located just north of Monticello, and it owns 7 miles of a main line that closed out. Now let me tell you a little bit about this railroad bed. It's
6 minutes.
It runs between Champaign. It was a local after the main lines were gradually diminishing. It was Champaign, White Heath, Monticello, Cisco, Argenta, into Decatur. Then it would go north to Clinton and back to White Heath via Weldon Springs, Lane, Weldon, DeLand, Lodge, and White Heath, and then into Champaign. When railroads got to be replaced by trucking and highways, and the elevator companies became super elevators, taking in trains that would have 125 cars or even more. The small wooden elevators became obsolete, and so the railroad lines were abandoned. This was in the 1980s, and Heartland Pathways bought 33 miles of that sort of bed, mainly for the prairie on either side, but also for trails, and also, if necessary, for re-rail. And part of our event at the present time is to attempt to re-rail between Whiteheath and Seymour. We own 4 miles there. And we're hoping to preserve the dignity of 7 miles of line that is intact, but not being used at present between Seymour and Bonneville and Staley into Champaign, and with the hope that we can get historic trains into Champaign, where there's a growing gentrification and lots of people, and they often enjoy doing things that are interesting. And when you have a railroad bed like that, the land on the other side can support prairie. We have some very good prairie sites there. So Heartland Pathways is into rails, trails, and greenways. So the organization that we're working with is the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, and it's already obtained railroad steel, and we're looking for tires to gradually bring that line back into Champaign. It's not something that's going to happen quickly, but parts of that corridor are very good prairie. And we would encourage you to look at these sites and figure out what you can do with them. And they become sources of seed and sources of wonder. You can't go to Lodge Park without being impressed by the plants that are there. If you get bitten by the bug, whether it is historic railroads or natural history, it's there. And just down the road is Allerton Park. And Allerton Park was bought by Sam Allerton, who made money in the Civil War by providing food to the Union Army. And he bought a lot of land, including Allerton Park. He gave Allerton Park to his son, and the son eventually willed that park to the University of Illinois. So we have 4 miles of railroad bed there that's alive with prairie, and it's quite a lot of it is adjacent to Allerton Park farms that support Allerton Park. So if you're wandering around in the Monticello area, think about Lodge Park, but then think about going to Allerton Park, where there's a wonderful house and a developed area with statues and gardens and formal turn of the century type landscaping, but it also has natural areas, and so there are bottomlands and uplands, and so that's also a good place to go where there are interesting things. And we would hope, we have another debate there as to whether to put a trail through that prairie or to give the prairie its existence. And we need these local sites. They're not the best, they're not real prairie, but that's all we have. And so we have a debate about whether to put a trail, especially a wide trail, through a natural area that we will never get again. But I think we're near to the end of the day, and thanks for listening, and if possible, think about going out in early spring to Lodge Park and Allerton Park and Shady Rest and getting to know what your natural history heritage is. This is Dave Monk, a Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.